Hi there, Ross. It's been about a year, and we have you back here on my Substack channel. So glad to have you back. And this time you're here to talk about your new novel, Colossus. So tell me what it's about.
So, Colossus is about a pastor in a small Michigan town, a rural town, and he is the major domo, the power broker of his town. He's the biggest church. He's also a successful real estate mogul, a local mogul. He owns a trailer park and various properties, and he's very well off. He's about 40 years old. He's got, on the surface, a perfect or near perfect life, an attractive wife and three children. And he is, enjoying his time in the sun and his ability to wield power. He's also a philanderer. He has at least one mistress at the start of the book, and then he ends up and he has another woman, and the implication is that there's other ones as well. So his morality is questionable, and he also harbors a secret, which I don't want to spoil too much of, but it relates to his past and where he comes from, which is not that town um, in the Midwest. And he's not who he says he is. And someone from his past arrives to remind him of who he is. And then he must reckon with the fallout of that and the potential collapse of this life he has meticulously constructed. So that's kind of the broad strokes of it.
Yep, yep. Before we jump into more of the themes of the book, I was curious if the novel's title was related to the Emma Lazarus poem, The New Colossus, or
So
what the
it,
origin of the title was.
it was not related to the poem necessarily, though I was certainly very aware of the poem. There's also a Sylvia Plath.
Hmm,
I'm trying to
hmm.
remember. It's a book of poems, I think.
Yes,
Book,
yeah, I do believe that's
but
correct.
it's funny. I think it's a word, that's always, I think of words in terms of their resonance and how they sound and how they look and how they feel. And it was a word that always stuck out to me.
Mm,
And I remember thinking about what to call this book. And you've working titles, and the main character is named Teddy Star. So I think
hmm,
for a while I was just working off calling it Teddy Star, and I don't think I wanted to do that.
hmm, hmm,
And I wanted a word that could sum it up in some way, or the aspirations of Teddy in particular. Teddy, he wants to be, a Colossus, at least a local a local Colossus, and certainly to him, dominating this town is is a great thing. And he has other ambitions too. As the novel progresses, he starts to
hmm,
think about,
hmm.
well, what else can I do? It's very all American, hunger and longing for greatness with a dark undercurrent. So the title, it sort of carried that for me. I'm also just fond of one word titles. I'm a big
Hmm,
DeLillo fan, so
hmm.
Libra,
Yeah.
Underworld, um, or even his Americana, and then
Hmm,
even
hmm,
the other titles tend to be short. The names,
hmm,
Mao Mao Tzu, um, and so on. So those kinds of titles really always jumped out to me from when I was young, just picking up a book and thinking it through. Whereas I tend to be put off by longer titles.
hmm, hmm.
Uh, the Jonathan Safran Foer book title types.
Right, right.
I there's something twee about it I don't really
Hmm,
like.
hmm,
So yes, I do think about titles. I was fortunate to have named most of my books. I have decided for the titles on. I mean, something
hmm.
that
Yeah.
You probably know, but listeners may or may not know, is authors don't always decide what their books are called, and often um, what determines the title will just depend on how willing the publisher is to listen to the author. So
Right.
I've been lucky with Colossus. I was lucky with Last Century. Those are my titles. I wanted them to be called that. I put a lot of thought into it, and the publishers agreed. I was less unlucky with another novel of mine, which is not as well known, which I am proud of, which came out in 2022, called The Night Burns Bright, and that was not my title idea. In essence, I was given many different titles to choose from. I didn't really like any of the options, and I backed into that one because it felt better than the alternatives I was being given.
Right.
That was
Right.
one instance where I did not like the title all that much. But
Right.
you live with it. It's not your decision.
Yeah. The other thing it reminded me of was the line from Julius Caesar, which comes in Act 1, Scene 2. The why man he doth bestride the narrow world like a colossus. That
Yeah.
one. So yeah, well, I mean, it definitely hits you hard. So that's good to have a title like that. It leaves an impression. So another big thing I noticed compared to your last novel, Glass Century, which we talked about previously, was you've moved from New York to the Midwest. Like you mentioned before, we're in the kind of northern rural area of Michigan. And what was the motivation behind moving to the Midwest for you?
Yeah, so I've spent a lot of time in the Midwest. I'm very fond of it. So my ex and someone I'm very close to, she's from there.
Mm-hmm.
So I've spent a lot of time visiting and enjoying it. So in any kind of I don't want people to read this book and go, oh, he doesn't like it there. Actually, quite do. I quite like rural climes and even small towns. I'm a city kid. But yeah, but I've been, I've always, growing up in New York City, I think I've always been fascinated by the dynamics of smaller towns because, you can see certain small town dynamics in cities, like my neighborhood, for example, which is somewhat closely knit, and does have its characters and have its, power brokers and its people who are influential and accrue you know, clout through their ties to the political system or the church. So
Mm-hmm.
I see that. I saw that growing up in my outer borough neighborhood. But a rural town is different. It's a very different dynamic, and there's a long, rich history of literature about the American small town. I
Mm-hmm.
think of
Mm-hmm.
Winesburg, Ohio. I think of Sinclair Lewis and his portrayals of town life, often skewering it. Elizabeth Strout, in the modern age, and so on.
Faulkner.
Um, so I've written a city novel. Last
Mm-hmm.
Century is very much a city novel.
Mm-hmm.
Um, the novel I mentioned before, The Night Burns Bright, which most people on Substack aren't as familiar with, though it had its own readership, but not one that is sort of in the mix as much these days. It was published a few years ago now. That's actually set in an upstate New York in a rural setting as well.
Mm-hmm.
So for this, I've been to Michigan a lot, so I know it well. I think when you go places, as a writer, you observe, you get ideas. I've sat in church. I mean, I've seen multiple pastors in action. So this is not one pastor. But I was very interested in the role of the pastor. So I'm Jewish, not Christian. But I find the whole dynamic fascinating. The ability of a religious leader to wield a great deal of influence over people, and also how much they are involved in secular affairs. And this can vary church to church and town to town. But I have observed dynamics that are not so different than Teddy Stars, and that the pastor is also uh, meddling in real estate or owns property or has another business, and the business is trickling into the church. And there's the question of, at times, is the pulpit being used to promote the business interests? And this doesn't always happen. And certainly, my novel is a work of fiction. I'm imagining much of it, but all of this was swirling through me. And then the other part that was very influential was beginning to read Richard Ford's novels, especially The Sports Writer
Yeah,
and
it's the epigraph
Independence
for your
Day.
novel.
And they're wonderful. And though that's about suburban New Jersey, it gets at some of those same town dynamics. It's not these are not city novels at all. And in the second, in both the first and the second book, the protagonist, Frank Bascombe, he is a sports writer, or former sports writer, one-time aspiring novelist who turns to real estate, and these are great real estate novels. And so, though I myself am not in the real estate industry and do have a bit of skepticism about the real estate industry, to say the least, I'm also very drawn to the mechanics of it and the people in it. Some of my favorite scenes in Independence Day, are the ones I was most amused by, certainly, is Frank Bascombe, the realtor, taking this family from property to property, and they won't buy. They're his white whale. He's trying to get them into a house, and he can't quite get them there. But that was influential too. So in terms of thinking about Teddy Starr, who's a
Hmm.
property owner, in the novel, he has a trailer park, which he thinks is maintained very well, and is maybe not maintained so well. That also was coming through.
Yeah, yeah. It's very interesting, the commentary on, the nodes of social capital in a particular small town American community. It seems like that's a dynamic that's very much in flux today, because there's been a move away from, or a secularization, a move away from the churches. So it's curious, like in some places, like who are the power brokers of particular communities, and what's, to what extent do the different nodes of power in a particular community overlap and interact today, and it seems very much in flux. So one of the things that I also, in my first pass review, and I just have up on Goodreads right now after I finished your book, was that it felt like a little bit of a commentary on Fitzgerald's Aside, which was like in his unfinished last novel, which was There Are No Second Acts in American Lives. I wonder to what extent you were riffing on this idea, whether consciously or unconsciously or ironically or sincerely, just about American reinvention, or lack thereof, because it
Yeah,
seems to be
it's one
something
of
new
those.
going on.
It's a good question. I'm a big Fitzgerald fan. That being said, it's one of those quotes that never quite resonated with me, because
Hmm.
there are, in
Hmm.
fact, second acts. There are third
Right.
acts. I mean, Donald Trump's on. I don't even know which
Right.
act Donald Trump is on right now.
Yeah.
America's all about reinvention.
Hmm.
Yeah,
Hmm.
so yes, very much so. I mean, there's something very Fitzgeraldian about Teddy Starr. Just as Gatsby, grasping towards his green light, turns to life of crime. Teddy Starr himself is chasing that green light. That the great American promise of money and power, not necessarily more impure, since Gatsby is erecting this empire to get him his daisy. Teddy Starr, more venal. He's building an empire because he wants to build an empire, and if the women and the women can follow. And he's very fond of women sexually,
Hmm.
but
Hmm.
he's not one that's necessarily building deep long-term connections with them. Maybe the exception of, I would say, I thought of him, and there's a character, Gertrude, his mistress, who seems to understand him, and he seems to understand her, at
Hmm.
least more so than with his wife.
Hmm.
But yeah, Teddy definitely has the Gatsby in him.
Hmm.
if maybe darker in some ways. But also, yeah, it's funny. The second acts in American life. I always thought about that quote, and Fitzgerald is brilliant, but it was always funny how canonical it became because it just simply is not true. In fact, America is a country of second acts. It's a country of third acts. It's a country where you can be a criminal, or you can be a failure. You can have embarrassed yourself. You could have hurt people, and you can find a way forward if you are lucky enough, clever enough, manipulative enough, um, or earnest enough too, or hardworking enough. There are many ways back. It's not. I'm not trying to criticize reinventions. There are good ways to reinvent. But I wish Fitzgerald had no way of knowing Donald Trump, having died before Donald Trump was born. But that man is on many acts, and there, beyond him, there are many examples of people who throughout history, on a grander scale, on a smaller scale too, go somewhere new and reinvent. Some ways it's getting harder to do it, I think, with the rise of the internet, the rise of surveillance.
Hmm. Hmm.
It's harder to just head to a new town, invent a new name, create a new
Yep.
identity for yourself. Used to be, I'd say, more feasible.
Yeah. Yeah.
But I see what Teddy has done. Spoiler: Teddy Starr is not his real name. I won't dig too deep into it. Um, but he's fundamentally very American. It's something in some ways, all American, but there's many types of
Yeah.
all.
Yeah. I thought the novel in general was very preoccupied with the concept of American identity. It's very forward in terms of religious and political identity. I think you kind of bounce back and forth between sometimes an anthropological approach or just descriptive approach, and then maybe sometimes a little bit of a satirical approach.
Hmm.
Because I think we see a lot of portrayals of Red America and a little bit of how there's some struggles with social capital. There's a little bit lower social capital and how that manifests in some of these rural places. And then some of the people who perhaps maybe like Teddy Starr himself, who are kind of exploiters of that reality on the ground. Or, are they exploiters or not? I think that's a bit of an open question. I'm not sure necessarily how you see that.
Yeah, to an extent, he's definitely an exploiter. I hope I didn't want to make my portrayal of the townspeople as I did not want them to be seen as these kind of rubes or these people who deserve it. If anything, um, I hope from reading the book, you see Teddy in action, and the people themselves. Some are very taken with him, and then some challenge him too. Um, or when he's going door to door at his trailer park, Teddy is not the one who's seen necessarily in the positive light at all, and it's the trailer park denizens who are, skeptical of him, and rightfully
Mm-hmm.
so. So I do think in these towns, in cities too, but certainly in towns where people know each other, and it can be in some ways easier to get known in this very hyper local way and to wield authority because your family knows this family, or you're very tied into these various institutions that are tight knit. It can be in some ways easier to exploit. People know Teddy, they like Teddy's the pastor, so of course if Teddy wants to sell them a house, they'll let him, or Teddy will be their broker. Yeah, and so Teddy's got his fingers in all these different pots. And if you are in a town where you're personally known, yeah, there are ways to take advantage of people. Where in the city people get scammed all the time, but um, it's not like one individual can say, "Well, I'm known to these people," but literally two doors down, they have no idea who you are. There's that anonymity to a city where you can feel like a big shot, or even a neighborhood. Like I'm the king of the neighborhood. I sit on I'm the chair of the community board, or I'm even the city councilman or something. But in a city like New York, a lot of people just won't know who you are, or they won't care, and it can be very transient. So people are coming in, they're coming out. So to a new resident, what does it mean that another one has been here 40 years? What do these civic groups actually mean? And
Hmm.
there are ways you can lament all of that. At the same time, it does diminish the power of those local power brokers, of which Teddy is one. So in a town, you are able to wield authority in a certain way, and I think in a city it's harder.
Hmm. Hmm. Yeah, there's was especially with the rise of technology, you see, in some respects, it seems like the returns to being a important local power broker are in decline in some respects because you don't have local news that is putting your name out there. You're competing against a national news environment or a state news environment, et cetera, on people's phones. People spend more time in their house. There's less third spaces, et cetera. It becomes harder to be a local imminent person and then
Mhm.
also to leverage being a local imminent person potentially today. I don't know. I mean, it's not like
Yeah,
I'm doing the
yeah,
sociology today, but
I think that to an extent that's true, but you still find in smaller towns, smaller cities. Yes, even with the collapse of those networks, it's true you can't quite dominate the way the old machine bosses did in cities, for example. Those networks, those local networks have atrophied. But I still think there's opportunity,
yeah,
and
yeah.
the church offers one certainly, or the synagogue. It's not just a
Hmm.
Christian phenomenon, but we
Right.
are a nation with majority Christian. I am, as a Jew, thinking often about Christianity, particularly the style of Christianity, Protestant Christianity. Though I don't use the term evangelical, there are elements of evangelical, the evangelical way in Teddy's church. I don't
Hmm.
specify that, but I would
Hmm.
say if you're going to chart him and his church on a theological map, I would say it's more toward evangelical Protestantism,
Hmm.
certainly not
Hmm.
Catholic.
Right, right.
I grew up in a Catholic neighborhood around Catholics.
Hmm.
I became more interested in this kind of rural Protestantism, which is a big part of the United States. You can find Catholics in rural areas too, for sure. But
Yeah.
traditionally is more of an urban phenomenon, and then these various farm towns and smaller places became Protestant strongholds, and so there's definitely a Protestantism, and actually trying to remember in my memory. I actually have not reread the book
Hmm.
in a little bit. I was trying to remember if Teddy evinces anti-Catholic sentiment or not, maybe in passing. But you get in these places, if you can find your anti-Semitism. But if anything, I'd say they probably think more about Catholics. Or sometimes even Mormons, anti-Mormon, anti-Catholic versus anti-Jew.
Hmm. Hmm. Yes, yeah. Growing up in Cleveland in the Midwest, it's a strong Catholic area.
Hmm.
Catholic schools are very strong. Catholic dioceses are strong social organizer. Um, there is, of course, Protestantism around in different churches, and I think the people who do make a habit of regular attendance do tend more to have adopted evangelical styles more so than the old mainline style. I think
Hmm.
that's something that like Ross Douthat had written about how a lot of the decline in religious attendance among Christians occurs in the mainline denominations more so than denominations that adopt more evangelical or just are full on evangelical. And it's interesting. Obviously, this is stronger in different regions than others. I don't know the specifics of the Midwest. The other thing that the novel reminds me of sociologically are things like we were touching on this, like the changes in social capital in these rural places. Is books like Robert Putnam's Bowling Alone, Charles Murray's Coming Apart, and The Big Sort, which is by Bill Bishop. And so some of the things that those books raise is how a lot of the former power brokers of local communities, small time communities, they've just entirely exited them. There's been a brain drain from those sorts of places. So you wonder to what extent, like, what does it take for, or what would it look like to, for the American elite or the just even a petite elite to return to those communities? What would that do? How would that look today? How would they be received? Because now they're kind of just left without a lot of the leaders that they would have otherwise had, because there's greater concentration, greater sorting, things like that have occurred.
Yeah, I think the retreat from civic institutions played a huge role. Lower church attendance decreases the power of the priest or the pastor. You've definitely seen a decay of a lot of the ways that people were brought together. So it's true in that there are probably fewer Teddy stars than there once were. Um, Something I can say is that they do to an extent still exist. Um, and there are ways through business and through commerce someone can still accrue wealth and influence and power. Even on a small scale, and sort of the durable business seems to be real estate. So much is been obliterated by machines, by the internet, perhaps now by AI. But if you're a wheeler or dealer of land, if you're a landlord, if you're a property developer, if you're a realtor, um if you are someone who is savvy in these matters, you can still make a nice chunk of change and still command quite a bit of influence. It's some ways the owning of property, is the great American religion, and the ability to own more property, to be an investor, to be someone who can dominate a business like this, even on a small scale, um, is you know still it's still one way to get ahead. How does one get ahead in 2020's America? There's you can scheme. You do your crypto schemes. You certainly go into the tech world if you're fortunate to
Bay
be
Area
made a bundle
VC.
in AI.
Hmm. New York
You can start
finance.
a small business. There's all kinds of things you can do. Real estate, it's sort of eternal. It's sort of the beating heart of everything.
Hmm. Hmm.
And you saw with the pandemic, prices going up so much. That was on my
Yeah.
mind too.
Yeah. Yeah.
There are ways one could have really made a killing for a few years. So Teddy's kind of in
22.
that environment. He alludes to price increases in the book.
Hmm. Hmm.
Um, so I think it's true. These things have all declined and decayed. But there are ways for the local influential person to have money and power and to use it.
Hmm. Yeah. The stereotype you see a lot of the time is like the local car dealership owner, right?
Hmm.
That's one thing that didn't necessarily appear in the book, but I think that's like
Yes.
a mold that would be very much in line with that. It reminds me of the television show Friday Night Lights, the
Mm.
character Buddy Garrity,
Yes, I
right?
remember, buddy.
Yes, yes. So Buddy Garrity is kind of that figure, and it's also a lot of the times connected to local sports. That's not something that I believe was a major thing in the novel. I don't recall that at
Yeah,
all. But
Teddy's not that keen on
yeah,
sports. A little bit. His
yeah.
son plays, but yes, I mean the car dealership owner is in that same in that same
that
vein,
role.
and
Yeah.
and it's a very durable business, one that's very,
Hmm.
very American.
Yeah. Yeah.
Um, so yeah, these things continue, they persist, and the people there at the top can still be very important.
Mm-hmm. Yes. Yeah. And so another thing that was on my mind is there's a lot of talk about how we're becoming less of a textual culture and more of an oral culture. I think this figured a little bit into the novel where, a lot of Teddy being an important local figure, an important local power broker is premised on his charisma. And so it was, of course, reminiscent, we've already brought him up, of Donald Trump, or perhaps, more recently with Zoran Mandami. And so I wondered to what extent you're thinking about the shift away from a textual based culture where we're celebrating things like multi-hour long Lincoln Douglas debates to now being on, 30-second, 60-second vertical videos, and what that means. I think I sensed to some degree some ambivalence about that. I don't think it necessarily is a full Neil Postman amusing ourselves to death type of critique, but I just wondered, what were your thoughts on that about, the colonization of intellectual and public discourse by modes of entertainment?
Well, I'm a big fan of using ourselves to death. I think Postman got a lot right, and I'll say, since as he says, since the rise of television, you've seen certainly in the political arena a movement to charisma politics, a movement to image politics. I am not completely negative in that I do think substance still matters. I do think a message still matters, what you're trying to say. And as we move into this kind of post-textual culture, we still engage with text quite a bit, whether it's literally with texts or emails, or um, in the realm of places like Substack, where writing has persisted and even found popularity, and the fact that even books today still sell. Um, and publishing as an industry is not nearly as endangered as other industries that have been beset by technological change. So it's a really interesting time, but undoubtedly, yes. I mean, Trump is on my mind. Teddy himself is a Trump supporter. By novel's end, and I won't say too much, Teddy is looking to a possible reinvention, a new career. And you can kind of guess where a charismatic man of God might go if he wants a little more temporal power. Yes, I mean the ability to charm and manipulate. In some ways, it's not new to this time. I think you can see it in politics um, throughout the 20th century. I mean, 19th century, there are many demagogues as well, but it's true. I mean, the mode of communication has become image. It's become video. Whether it's internet, whether it's television, and that's often the first way you come up against someone. And Donald Trump is the apotheosis of it. He is the merger of entertainment and politics in the most direct way imaginable, and in amusing ourselves to death. Reagan is on Postman's minds. The book is published in 1985, and of course, Reagan was a movie actor, and that I think Postman would have reacted to Trump after the horror. He would have said, "Well, of course, America produced this, of course."
Right. Right.
Um, Now you see, yeah, that now there are many dynamics to that. Zoran Mamdani, yes, also a candidate of image and charisma as well, and with a message that resonated with people. In the way Trump's message did too. It wasn't merely Trump was a reality TV star. I mean, he's not the first person of television to try to seek political office. It's also kind of what he embodied and what he was talking about. Um, but certainly the Trump's ability to come back and to reinvent was on my mind. And you see that with Teddy Starr. You see it in his ability to outrun his past, um, coming to Michigan, and also by the end of the novel, there's another possible reinvention, which seems like all is lost for him. He's grasping for a way forward. Then his wife is there to remind him that you might succeed, but I know who you are. Just as some ways Donald Trump can't outrun himself, no matter how much success he has. Uh, there's something you can tell he's not fully content, and he knows deep down he can't have all that he wants. And Teddy Starr, in the same way, he wants so much, and he knows there's a part of him that knows he cannot have it all.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. The striving and the reinvention. It also made me think about the capacity for belief or American credibility. I to wonder to what extent you're critical of that, or whether you think of that as a good thing. Americans, they seem they're eager to be fooled, or they're eager to believe, and that is what, especially if it's someone that's familiar, someone that they feel connected to in some way, shape, or form. Especially not necessarily because they agree per se ideologically, but because of some like aesthetic or symbolic connection. Sometimes it seems like one pushback I would say is it seems like our politics is increasingly about aesthetics and symbols and these, everyone will call it the culture war, but instead of what's the marginal tax rate, or what's this regulatory change that we need to make, that's never really going to dominate discourse. It's always about this Francis Fukuyama calls it thumos, this my desire to be recognized for X quality and so on. And I wonder to what extent this always rolls into this willingness to believe. And so there's like this pivotal scene in the novel where Teddy's facing a crisis, and he is able to climb himself out of this crisis, but it only works because of the power of belief to some extent, right? And
Yes, and certainly I'm thinking a lot about belief. On one hand, we need belief. I'm not anti-belief. I think you have to believe in things. You have to believe in you have to have values. You have to have hope. You have to have ambition too. Ambition is not evil, and can corrupt, but ambition can also be very good to have. At the same time, it can be exploited, and Teddy is an exploiter of it. Certainly by the end of the novel, but you also get to know him, to understand him more, and he's not simply someone to be scorned. There's something deeply human about him. Um, but yes, it's so much a part of the American mythos, belief. I mean, it's in some ways the most fundamental thing. And Burke Nation founded on belief. Certainly some would say belief in God, though many of the founding fathers were secular deists, or what would today be an atheist or de facto atheist. Some were religious as well. They were a confused bunch. But there was a belief in this country, a belief that we're going to make something new on this land, which we are gonna take from the Native Americans. But yeah, I can only be so cynical about all these things, because it is remarkable to believe, and I think it does characterize much of who we are and what we do. But there's the dark side of belief.
yeah.
But yes, so I think the belief that there's a dark undercurrent of it. There's the ability of others to take advantage of it. At the same time, I would say we need it too. I would not argue for a world beyond belief, a world without one. I think that would be a very dark world in its own way.
Totally, totally. Another character I thought of when reading the novel was Don Draper. I wondered to what extent, the transition from Richard Whitman to Donald Draper was kind of a transformation that was, had some parallels to your protagonist Teddy Starr. I wonder to what extent something like that was on your mind. It's just kind
Oh,
of
sure.
tracking back to the idea of reinvention. Another figure too that I was thinking of was, which is from real life, but also was adapted to a film, was Frank Abagnale, uh, where Leo plays in the was it Catch Me If You Can
Yes,
movie. Yes, so it's another. I mean,
definitely,
yeah.
definitely Draper for sure, consciously or unconsciously. Because I'm a big fan of Mad Men, and
Mhm.
I'd watched all of Mad Men, several years prior to writing this book. And I have, thought about the show quite a bit. Um, and certainly about someone like Draper in much the same way. If you think of Draper's life on the surface, it is a quintessential American life, what some would say the perfect life, the house, the family, the attractive wife, the young children. It's all lined up for him, making good money. But of course, he's not who he says he is, and this undercurrent there, and it tugs at him. In the same way with Teddy, Teddy and Don Draper each trying to outrun their pasts, and they can't. Uh, Past catches up.
Mhm.
That was the Faulkner line. The past is not even past. I never quote it quite correctly, but
Mhm.
the
Mhm.
past is all around us. So for someone like Teddy Starr, an invented name, Don Draper, of course, an invented name.
Mhm.
They want to be a certain way. They want to be perceived a certain way. For them, perception equals reality.
Mhm.
Um, but as comfortable as they may seem with it, we know they're not. And we know with Teddy too, there's a discomfort beneath the surface. The great opening episode to Mad Men was influential with me because if you recall, Don is seen with a woman in the opening episode, and you don't know quite who she is. In fact, you are led to believe, based on how the episode is framed, that the woman he's with in the city, he's visiting a woman in her apartment, is his girlfriend or his wife.
Mhm.
If not his wife, because I don't know if you don't see the ring. Certainly, the girl he's going steady with. They're very
Mhm.
loving and
Mhm.
playful in bed. And then when the episode closes, he's going home to Westchester to his family. And then you understand the woman in the city is the woman in the city. And then he's going back to live his other life with his wife, Betty. And in Colossus, Teddy Starr is visiting his mistress Gertrude. And the way I write it, I wanted to leave some ambiguity as to what is exactly happening here. Who is this woman? In the same way, Matthew Weiner in Mad Men creates this initial, really compelling scene where the viewer is wondering what is the nature of this relationship. And it also makes it, in one hand, you condemn it in all those classic ways, it's immoral. On the other ways, it makes it very human because you see whether it's Don with the woman in the city. I recall she's an artist. Um, Teddy and his banter with Gertrude, his mistress. You see, it's about the sex. Certainly, the sex is there, but also, um, there are these human bonds being formed.
Yeah.
So I found that very interesting. And yes, I think Teddy in many ways is a Don Draper-esque figure in terms of the success he has and the fact that he is good looking, debonair, and he's built this very attractive life for himself. of a similar age. Teddy's around 40. I think Draper, when the show opens, is
Mid
middle
30s.
late 30s, and
Yeah.
then is in his 40s. So they're at that point in their lives where they've gotten much of what they've wanted, or they think they have. They think they've outrun the past, right? If you think about Draper in Mad Men, by the time the show opens, Dick Whitman is more than a decade gone. Probably at that point, 15 years at least, maybe more. Teddy Starr, won't say his old name. I don't want to give away too much yet. Maybe we do more of these and more people have read the book. But for now, I'll keep that in the shadows. Teddy Starr thinks he's outrun his old name, his old past, because he too, has been out of that for about 20 years or more. But no, you're not safe. Um, and it's difficult just to be another person. You can try, but it's not simple.
Yeah, yeah. And I think we can say something similar about America potentially. I'm not sure if you're familiar with the book Albion Seed by David Hackett Fisher,
Not
but it
no.
yeah, so it's a it's a cultural history of America, and the
Oh
thesis
wow.
is that there are four founding or settling cultures of America that
Hmm.
come from Albion, which is the old name for Britain. So from Britain, that's Albion Seed, and those
Yeah.
four founding cultures are the Puritans, the Quakers, the Cavaliers, which is like the Southern gentry
Hmm.
in the Virginia Tidewater area, and then the Scotch Irish, which is a bit of a misnomer
Yes.
because of people from the border of Scotland and England who then go over to Ulster and then over to America. And obviously that's like the J.D. Vance cultural heritage that J.D. Vance lays claim to. And so those are the four founding cultures of America, and he traces all the different say, customs or cultural ways that they have throughout the book. And it's incredibly detailed. You go over even into linguistics. So he'll point out how the Puritan speechways are things that now we're familiar with the characteristic or stereotypical Boston accent. How they're
Yes.
dropping R's in the middle of words, Harvard, things like that, right? And so all that's in there. And so when you read this book, it seems like a skeleton key to understanding like the different regional patterns and even the national politics of America. There's a famous, online internet famous review of the book on Slate Star Codex, the now
Yeah.
on Substack is Astral Codex blog, and people look at it as like, is this the skeleton key to the red and blue coalitions of today? Because people see like the Puritan, Quaker, so the Northern coalition, and then the Scotch Irish and Cavalier coalition
Yes.
as the Red coalition or the Southern coalition. And this explains politics in America all the way through from the founding to today. People still say that, for example, and even like at the presidential level at the end of the book, Fisher is walking through like each president. Here's each president that has like this heritage and so on. And it's only kind of when the book was published, and now today we're kind of that it's harder and harder. There's the amount of like English ancestry, for example, to specifically trace it back to those specific lines. Although it transfers over to other people, to the immigrants who come. Of course, they bring some stuff too, but they say the settling effects are stronger than the later effects. You end up seeing this imprint over and over again. I just wonder to what extent, can America outrun its past either? Obviously, there's a lot of change, a lot of people have aspirations and so on, but to what extent are these deep roots always going to be there and will always shape what America is?
And it's really really good lot to think over there. I would say we're a country that is both always reinventing itself and always going to be the subject of change. At the same time, we are a country too of our past. We are burdened by certainly in the sins at the foundation: slavery, genocide, um, war, right?
Mm-hmm.
Our heritage.
Yeah.
America's interesting. I think there's parts of us that want to push past all of it and to say we are new, we are different. We are not the British who are weighted by thousands of years of history. We can make our own institutions. We can make our own traditions. Um, it's funny because in some ways we are in a post WASP world, though it hasn't been remarked upon all that much. Not as much as one would think. That if you look at the history of America, the WASP, white Anglo-Saxon Protestant, a
Hmm.
certain type of WASP, the blue
Right.
blood WASP, wielded power in this country uninterrupted, from the end of the revolution into the 20th century, where if you went to the top of any institution, whether it's a college, a bank, a political party, you'd find WASP. Or, maybe on the local level, the Catholics had power, but a Catholic could not be president until Kennedy. And slowly but surely, that WASP influence has completely disappeared to the point where, as much as Donald Trump on a technicality is a WASP, in no way does he embody WASP culture. George Bush, both Bushes did. I mean, W tried to outrun it, being the Texan, the plain spoken man, the blue collar man. But of course, his father was a WASP,
Yes.
and he went to Yale,
Yep.
and so he carried that with him. But if you look at the Democratic Party today and the Republican Party today, neither is led by WASPs any longer in the way we would understand them.
Hmm. Yeah. JD's a convert to Catholicism.
Gee, you're right.
Says no
Imagine,
longer a
imagine
wasp.
telling
Yeah.
someone, right, 80 years ago, the vice president of the United States would be a Catholic convert from, this sort of ambiguous Protestantism. It all seemed very unlikely and strange. And is married to an Indian woman,
Yep.
right?
Yep.
So we are a nation that is changing and in flux, and that is good. I mean, I like that we are a nation that changes, but it's true. At the same time, our past defines us. Our treatment of African Americans, of Native Americans, of other out groups too. Whether there's the Irish fighting for recognition, the Jews, the Italians. So it's a little of everything. But we are outrunning our past. We are still haunted by our past too. You see it now, certainly on the right, the talk of heritage Americans. This is like a new phenomenon or it's not new, I should say. It's very old in that it harkens back to the nativists of the 19th century, the Know Nothing Party, and the anti-Catholic sentiment in America. Those who said America is for the founders, those WASPs, and not for the newcomers. It's the irony of the heritage American, where a Scotch Irish or a Catholic person, which I'm sure many of these heritage American types are, and they say, well, America is not for the Mexicans and not for the Latinos and not for the Somalians. It's for heritage, real heritage Americans. Then go watch Gangs of New York and tell Bill the Butcher that this descendant of an Irish immigrant who, on a technicality fought in the Civil War, maybe didn't want to and did. Imagine telling Bill the Butcher that these are the heritage Americans now. Those types would be rolling in their graves. That was not a heritage American. Being in America since the 1850s doesn't make you a heritage American in their eyes, or even probably at that point, the 1820s or 1810s. They when they talked heritage American, for them, it was a Protestant who's there at the founding. And yeah, there are those people today. You have Mayflower people. They're out there, not many, but they're out there. But you've got this kind of new class of, quite frankly, nativist and racist, who, is making this, popularizing this new term, not aware of the irony. And maybe this is very American too, where we'll repeat our past without knowing it. And I see that in a lot of the anti-immigrant sentiment today. And it's why I'm not anti-immigrant simply because I am the product of immigrants, as I'm sure you are too. My people came in the late 19th century, from Russia and Eastern Europe, in these great migration waves where the borders were completely open. And so I could never be anti-immigrant because I think it would be completely hypocritical. But the way people talk about immigrants today, you study history, it's just a cycle. You can see the same exact rhetoric in the 1840s, the 1890s, the 1920s when the border was shut almost completely. This idea that there were too many Italians, too many Irish, too many Jews. They were not real Americans. They were not white Americans. They were suspect, bringing suspect ideas. So yeah, in terms of the United States, we do tend to repeat our past. And then someone like Teddy Starr, he's a wasp on the surface, but I won't spoil it too much to say he's not really a wasp. He's not a true wasp. He's got an origin story that's completely different than the one that though he himself doesn't talk in the terms of heritage American. He's certainly not a heritage American.
Hmm. Yeah, I mean, it reminds me like a lot of the people who do lay claim to it, that sort of label. I'm sure you're familiar with like someone like Nick Fuentes, for example,
Yes,
or figures like Myron Gaines or
yes,
Sneeko or
yes,
the Tate brothers and things like that. I mean, although they aren't necessarily the ones who exactly lay claim to that label, but I think Fuentes maybe or Groypers in general may
yeah,
more so identify with that label, which is funny, but they're I think they're also aware that they're not those things. It's almost just like
no,
a nostalgia for an idea that doesn't exist and in some ways can't exist anymore. You can't like rerun the past. You can't change. We can't
no,
make the
and
immigrants disappear somehow. But now I think they have like a kind of a strange vision in some respects. For like a new ethnogenesis. I don't know if you've heard the term like castizo futurism and stuff like this. There's a lot of like
yes,
silliness, but I don't know. Like it is America's obviously we have reinvented ourselves in some ways as well, but we also bear our past with us, and it's interesting to see that dynamic continue, and how long will our the deep roots of the founding continue to have a strong hold. I think they do have a strong hold, and whether it's in the religious culture, whether it's white identity, or whether it's the legacy of slavery, whatever it may be, we can't just always discard it. I think to some extent it'll always shape us, and we'll have like new flavors come in. I think, but the problem is that it's reconciling those things. Like what will be the compromise, or what will be the synthesis that is reached among these different competing groups. Like there has to be something that's forged. Just like with these, it's not like those original founding cultures in America all agreed with each other. I mean, there were slaves at the time, and there was the on the borders, there was like French settlers, and there was also the Spanish. Even further is more in the Southwest and Mexico and so on. But they're still creating a dynamic, and the founding, the Constitution, the Bill of Rights. That was the second attempt too. There was the Confederacy, the Confederation before that, and these are compromises that had to be struck. And so I think in some respects, because we are in the post WASP, the post Cold War, all these things have, even the post World War II order, they're kind of in decline. But America still has a future, and the question will be like, what does that compromise look like? Does it look does it look like things like Donald Trump or Zora Madami, or what does it end up looking like exactly? And how can we do this when so much of our actual serious discourse is entertainment, and is not real, and is obsessed with things that are more superficial than, say, really deep things that actually tie us together to each other. I don't know.
yeah. The future will be certainly contested. I think one strength of America is the elasticity, the fact that the founders were very wise to not establish a national religion. They created this country to be a pluralistic country. I think there were mistakes the founders made, but that was the stroke of genius, along with the First Amendment. And so, yeah, I mean, we're a country that's going to keep changing. That's what strong countries do. It's what dynamic countries do. Weak countries don't change. Um, and we'll see what that looks like. I do think America has a future, and I think despite I think the left and the right each have these declinist attitudes. You see it in both parties or both factions. The left will say, well, Donald Trump has destroyed America. There's no republic. There's no going back. The right will say the immigrants have ruined it. The barbarians are here. There's no future. I reject that talk. I fundamentally do. I think there is a future, and I think it's very easy in the present to feel that way, to feel you are living at this pivot point and that all will fall apart from here. You know what? I mean, I'm sad to say I won't be around to cash on this bet, but I think there's going to be United States of America in 100 years from now. I think it'll be here in 500 years from now. I think you look at histories of empire, histories of countries. They
Mhm.
they last longer than you think. I'm not saying it's going to
Yeah.
last in 10,000 years, but we're going to be here longer than people think. The United States will outlast all of us. Put it that way. Everyone
Yes.
alive
Yeah.
today will perish. If they're perishing in these borders, will die in the United States of America as it exists. And I think that's a strangely controversial take. It
Yeah.
shouldn't
For some.
be, to
Yeah.
say that, yeah, I think in 2075 the United States of America will exist today as 50 states. Maybe we've added a 51st state. Who knows?
Maybe.
But
Yeah.
roughly speaking, we will be a country. We survived a brutal civil war, and absolutely catastrophic civil war. And in some ways, we have never faced a crisis remotely like that since. Though people like to say, well, today has echoes of that. I think there are some echoes of pre-Civil War times in America now, but with the caveat that but is much worse than that. I do not see armed conflict, north versus south, west versus east. Yeah, I don't see it. I see problems for this country. I'm not sugarcoating. I see a lot of challenges ahead, but I think fundamentally we're going to exist, and we're probably going to be, carrying on, flawed, but there.
Yeah.
Um, that's my rough view.
Yeah. Yeah. No, I think I'm optimistic about America too. I have I try to resist narratives of decline, but they're quite seductive. I think there's just a tendency in people
They
who are
are
drawn to
they're
history.
very very seductive.
Yeah. So I mean, that's a good note to end on optimism. Where can people find your new novel and find your writing? Because you're up to lots of
So,
different
so,
things.
so my novel's out April 28th. So you can pre-order it wherever books are sold right now. So if you go on, Barnes and Noble, you go on, Bookshop, you go on Amazon, wherever you go to your local bookstore, you can order it. Um, if you're listening to this after April 28th, it'll be have to see which bookstores it'll be in. Certainly it'll be in some. I know I'm doing a book launch on May 11th in New York City at PNT Knitwear, so definitely be copies for sale. We're also gonna have a little party before then on April 28th. I'll be announcing that, so you can find it there. But I'd say for now, go get it online wherever books are sold and go enjoy.
Excellent. Well, thanks for joining me, Ross.
Yeah, thank you for having me.